On a quiet Saturday morning, Rosa Alvarez opened the doors of her small cafe, a cozy place in the middle of the city. The sun's rays gently streamed in through the windows, illuminating the tables, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. Rosa had always dreamed of owning her own business, and after years of hard work, she had finally made it. The cafe, which was called El Rincón de la Taza, had become a popular place among the locals. The walls were decorated with old photos of the city and inspirational quotes, and the soft jazz sound always accompanied the customers. Rosa, a kind and determined woman, was always willing to listen to her customers' stories while pouring a coffee or cup of tea. That morning, a man walked into the cafeteria, looking around before taking a seat at a table near the window. He was Victor Ramirez, a local writer known for his sharp opinions on the city's social problems. Rosa recognized him immediately and came over to greet him. "How are you, Victor?" "The usual?" asked Rosa with a smile as she prepared a cup of her special coffee blend. "Yes, thank you. I'm looking for inspiration for a new article," Victor replied as he flipped through his notebook. "And I think this place has the perfect tranquility to think about." As Victor settled in, Rosa realized that something in him was different that day. There was something on his face that he hadn't seen before, a quiet worry. He decided not to ask, but he knew that, sooner or later, that concern would arise. In the distance, Carlos Medina, a young musician who also frequented the cafeteria, entered with his guitar in hand. Carlos was a creative soul, always on the lookout for new melodies for his next album. He greeted Rosa with a wave of his hand and sat down at a table near Victor's. Rosa noticed the interaction between the two men. Carlos had always admired Victor's opinions, although they did not always agree on everything. The contrast between them was evident. Victor serious and analytical, and Carlos spontaneous and full of energy. However, both shared a passion for local culture and social justice, albeit in very different ways. As Rosa Alvarez made her way on, the small town seemed not to fully understand her intentions. He had arrived there hoping to make a difference, but soon realized that the resistance to change was stronger than he imagined. The inhabitants of that place, although mostly well-intentioned, could not see beyond the limitations imposed on them by their own vision of the world. Throughout her life, Rosa had learned to listen to people before judging, and her ability to understand the emotions of others had led her to occupy a position of trust in many situations. However, in this town, she was not well received. His arrival had disrupted a routine that seemed to be unbreakable, and while his cafe had good reviews, many were reluctant to accept his ideas. Carlos Medina, his partner and friend, had always been his unconditional support. He had seen the passion in Rosa's eyes from the beginning, and was confident in her vision. However, even he began to notice the growing tension in the air. Every time a customer walked into the Café del Corazón, there was an air of doubt, of discomfort, as if something wasn't quite right. One afternoon, while Rosa was preparing a new recipe, Alejandro Torres walked through the door with a serious expression. Since his arrival in the village, Alejandro had been one of the few who was indifferent to the change that Rosa wanted to bring. He was not hostile, but he did not show an open attitude towards her either. In his mind, all that modernizing coffee was just a passing fad. "I think we need to talk," Alejandro said in a low tone, as if his presence in the cafe was already making the others feel uncomfortable. Rosa looked at him, surprised by the seriousness in his voice. I knew that Alexander, though somewhat reserved, was not a person who used to speak for no reason. He wiped his hands and motioned for him to sit down. "Of course, what is it about?" Rosa replied, inviting him to talk. Carlos, who was in the kitchen, looked up when he heard Rosa's words. Although he didn't say anything, his face reflected a mixture of concern and curiosity. Rosa had already had several conversations with people like Alejandro, but she felt that something deeper was happening this time. Something that perhaps he could no longer control. "I've heard some comments out there," Alejandro continued, looking around to make sure no one else was around. "Some aren't comfortable with the way you've tried to change things. It's not just coffee, Rosa. It's everything you're representing." Rosa watched him in silence, processing his words. She knew she had done things that not everyone could understand, but she was determined not to take a step back. "What I had in mind was not just to open a cafe, but to create a space of inclusion, a place where people could come without fear of judgment. "What I'm trying to do is not just change the menu or the decoration," he replied calmly. "I want this to be a space where everyone can feel welcome, no matter their history, their past, or their biases." Alejandro was silent for a moment, as if Rosa's words had touched some corner of his soul. However, he didn't seem to be completely convinced. I knew Rosa meant well, but the way people in the village viewed change was different. For many, the cafe wasn't just a place to enjoy a good coffee or cake. It was a refuge, a meeting point where old customs were part of everyday life. "I know, Rosa, but not everyone is ready for that kind of change. In this town, tradition is important to the people. It's not that they don't understand what you're trying to do, it's just that they're not ready," Alejandro replied, his tone now softer, as if he were looking for a way not to hurt Rosa's feelings. Rosa looked at him, trying to see things from his perspective. I knew that change was not something that could be forced overnight. However, he could not allow the fear of the unknown to prevent his vision from being fulfilled. I wasn't just opening a cafe, I was opening a door to a different future, one where inclusion and respect were the norm. Carlos, who had been silent until that moment, approached the table with a cup of steaming coffee. She placed the cup in front of Rosa and then looked at Alejandro. "It's true that customs weigh heavily," said Carlos with a calm smile, as he always tried to do in moments of tension. "But customs can also change. No one can stop what is destined to happen." Rosa nodded, grateful for her friend's support. Carlos had always been her rock, the one who reminded her that the important thing was to keep going despite the difficulties. "It's not about destroying what already exists, Alejandro," Rosa continued, her voice firm. "It's about creating something new, a place where differences aren't seen as something negative. A coffee that is more than just coffee. A place where people can be themselves without fear of being judged." Alejandro looked at her for a few seconds, as if he were pondering her words. Finally, he sighed. "You're right, Rosa. I hadn't seen it that way. Maybe I've been a little stubborn." Rosa smiled, relieved. Although he knew that the conversation with Alejandro was not over, he felt that he had at least sown a seed of understanding. He knew that it would not be easy to change the mentality of everyone in the village, but what he did know was that with time, patience and persistence, his message would get through. That afternoon, the Café del Corazón remained open until late. The lights were shining softly and the tables were occupied by people who, though still suspicious, were beginning to feel more comfortable in this new environment. As Rosa stared at the lively cafe, she felt a sense of peace. I knew I was doing the right thing, even if the path was still uncertain. As the days went by, coffee began to gain popularity, although not without challenges. Some villagers still looked askance at the people who were beginning to frequent the Café del Corazón. There were murmurs in the streets and half-hearted comments in the shops. But Rosa was not intimidated. He knew that things didn't change right away, but every customer who walked through the door, every conversation that took place at their tables, represented a small triumph. Carlos, for his part, continued to be the anchor of the cafe, always willing to listen to customers and offer a kind word, even when the atmosphere became tense. Rosa often silently thanked him for his support because it hadn't been easy for either of them. One afternoon, while Rosa was setting up a table by the window, a regular customer, Victor Ramirez, approached the bar with his coffee in his hand. He was an older man, known for his strong character and his tendency to give his opinion on everything that happened in the village. Victor was one of those who still believed that the past was better, that the old ways should be maintained at all costs. "Wow, it looks like things have changed here, huh?" Victor commented, looking with some disdain at the new customers who were chatting animatedly. Rosa looked at him calmly, not showing that his words affected her. I knew Victor was one of those people who took longer to accept change, but I also knew he had a good heart. "Change is part of life, Victor. Sometimes it's hard to adapt, but we all have something valuable to offer, no matter where we come from or who we are." Victor looked at her silently, as if he were evaluating her words. Finally, he let out a sigh and settled into one of the nearby chairs. "I know, but I can't help but think we're losing something in the process," he replied, his tone softer, as if he shared a concern that had been haunting him. Carlos, who had been watching the conversation from his post behind the bar, walked over to the table. I knew Victor wasn't easy to convince, but I also knew that a kind and patient approach was the best way to make him see things. "It's not about losing, Victor. It's about winning something new," Carlos said, resting one hand on the table with a friendly smile. "Sometimes what seems like a difficult change can be the opportunity for something better. Look around you. People are starting to find a place here where they can be themselves without prejudice." Victor looked at the customers who were chatting and smiled nostalgically. Although he still doubted the idea of such a radical change, something in the cafe atmosphere seemed to make him think that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth in what Carlos and Rosa were saying. That night, as the cafe closed, Rosa stayed for a moment longer watching the lights slowly go out. Carlos was in the back, cleaning the utensils. It had been just another day, and although there were no big celebrations, it felt like a small advance. Some new customers had approached with questions about the history behind the Café del Corazón, and Rosa had passionately explained her vision of an inclusive place, open to all. She approached Carlos and patted him on the shoulder. "Today was a good day, wasn't it?" Rosa said, with a smile that reflected the satisfaction of knowing that, although the road was long, they were making a difference. Carlos nodded as he finished cleaning a cup. "Yes, it was. With each passing day, more people begin to see what we are doing. And while not everyone understands it right away, we're creating a place that really matters." Rosa was silent for a moment, staring at the small coffee she had started with so much effort. She knew that there was still a long way to go, but something inside her told her that this cafe would be more than just a business. It would be the beating heart of a more united, more open, and more understanding community. The next day, a new group of customers arrived at the cafe. They were young, some foreigners with different accents that echoed in the air. They carried with them stories from different parts of the world, and as they sat at the tables, their conversations blended in with those of others, creating a unique atmosphere. Rosa watched as the gazes of some of the regular customers rested curiously on the new visitors. While some were receptive, others seemed uncomfortable, as if they didn't know how to react to the unknown. One of those customers was Alejandro Torres, a man who had lived in the town all his life. His rigid posture and direct words gave him a reputation for being a difficult man to please. Rosa had noticed that on several occasions, Alejandro did not look favorably on those who arrived from abroad, and it was not the first time that he found himself observing new international customers with suspicion. "How was everything, Alejandro?" Rosa asked as she brought him her usual coffee. "Well, Rosa," he answered, taking his cup with the same serious expression as always. "But what's going on here? There are more people from outside, right? It's as if the whole town has changed." Rosa smiled patiently. He knew that Alejandro was not ill-intentioned, only that change cost him more than others. She sat down in front of him with a calm look. "The world is changing, Alejandro. People are moving more than before, and that brings with it new perspectives. Here we do not judge anyone by their origin, but by what they bring with them. Everyone has something unique to contribute." Alejandro frowned, looking at the young men who were chatting animatedly in a corner of the cafe. "I don't know," he murmured. "I'm not so sure that all this accept everyone thing is that good. Sometimes I wonder if we are not losing something along the way." Rosa looked at him carefully. She knew that despite her doubts, Alejandro was not completely closing her mind. I just needed time to process the idea. In a soft but firm voice, Rosa continued, "Change does not mean losing what we are. It means learning to adapt, to grow. No one is asking you to abandon what you believe in, but they are asking you to be open to new ideas. Look at the young people there. They are learning from each other and bringing something new to the table. We're all here to build something better, together." Alexander remained silent, thoughtful. He knew Rosa was right, but he still struggled to see beyond his own experiences. He stared at the young people, listening to their laughter and conversations, and something inside him began to question whether all that change could really be so bad. Meanwhile, Carlos watched from the bar. I knew that Alejandro, like others, needed his time, but he also trusted that coffee had the power to change mindsets. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but every conversation, every action added up. The day continued, and the flow of people kept coming. Some stayed for a while, others just stopped by for a quick coffee, but they all shared one thing in common: the desire to connect. There was something in the air, something that made the Café del Corazón feel special. Maybe it was the diversity, or maybe it was the warmth of the place. Regardless of the reason, the truth was that little by little a community was forming, a community that, although still small, was already beginning to show signs of unity. That afternoon, Victor Ramirez returned to the cafe. It was no longer so often that he entered the door, but something had driven him to return. He approached Rosa, who recognized him instantly. "Today you can see that there is more life around here, eh?" Victor said, smiling in a less reserved way than before. Rosa nodded with a warm smile. "Every day, Victor. Every day more." Victor observed the atmosphere, the customers chatting, the younger ones sharing laughter with the older ones. Something inside him seemed to understand what was happening. The change he had been fearing didn't seem so scary anymore. Perhaps there was something about that mix of generations, cultures, and perspectives that could really make a difference. Before leaving, Victor paused for a moment, looking at Rosa with a softer gaze. "I guess all is not lost after all, is it?" he said, in a tone that was more of a question than a statement. Rosa looked at him with a calm smile, knowing that although it had been a long road, something about him had finally changed. "No, Victor, it's never lost. It's just changing." Evening began to fall, and the golden light of the evening filtered through the windows of the cafe, bathing the place in a warm softness. Carlos was behind the bar, cleaning the cups and preparing a new batch of coffee. There was something in the air that night, a feeling that floated above the scattered conversations and the clatter of cutlery and dishes. The cafe seemed to be fuller than ever, but in a different way, as if the space itself was breathing with the people who inhabited it. Rosa, while taking an order, glanced at the customers at the tables. More and more people stayed chatting, not only for coffee but because they felt part of something. Young foreigners were no longer seen as outsiders, but as an extension of the community itself. He had learned to recognize the small signs of change. The boy who had once been afraid to go near the bar and now sat with his friends, the older man who used to complain about the new ones, but who now offered a smile. At that moment, Lena, a young woman who had recently arrived in the village, entered the cafe. You could see her nervousness when she took her first steps inside the place, but something about her resonated with the energy that now permeated the place. She approached the counter, where Carlos greeted her with a friendly smile. "Hello, how can I help you?" Carlos asked. Lena hesitated for a moment before speaking, searching for the words. "Do you have anything sweet? Something that reminds me of home," he said with a slight shy smile. Carlos smiled, knowing exactly what he wanted. She made him a small cup of carrot cake, a homemade touch that always seemed to reconnect people to their roots. Lena accepted the dish with gratitude. "First time here?" Rosa asked her, who came over to greet her. "Yes, I came recently. I'm new to the village," Lena replied nervously, but delighted by the kindness of the two. Rosa smiled kindly. "This is a good place to meet, to connect. There is no rush here, just good conversations." Lena nodded, looking around, feeling a little less alone in that space full of new faces, but also of a familiarity that was slowly beginning to form. While Lena was drinking her coffee, a couple of other customers arrived, greeting acquaintances with hugs and laughter. Victor, who was still near the entrance, watched the flow of people and the atmosphere in the cafe. The transformation of the place surprised him more and more. It wasn't just the coffee that had changed, but the people, the way they looked at each other and treated each other. There was something in the air that made everything feel more human, closer. Rosa, seeing Victor at the entrance, approached him with a firm step. "Are you staying this time, Victor?" he asked with a smile. "Perhaps. Just for a little while longer," he replied, though his tone of voice was no longer as distant as before. They both were silent for a moment, staring at the bustle of the tables and the soft sound of conversations. It was as if time had slowed down, as if reality was taking a break and everything was finally aligning. The small changes, The kind looks, the gestures of patience seemed to have fit into perfect harmony. Lena, observing all that, felt that her place here was already beginning to form, as if in that cafe she could find something more than just a temporary refuge. There was something about the atmosphere that welcomed her, a sense of belonging that even she hadn't anticipated finding in such a small place. That's when she dared to speak with a little more confidence. "I think this place has something special," he said, looking at Rosa and then at Carlos. Rosa smiled at him as she poured a new round of coffees. "It does, and you're part of that now too." The cafe began to fill with a mixture of voices and laughter. Victor, who no longer felt so uncomfortable, approached the bar where Rosa and Carlos were working. As he got closer, he watched more closely as people who had previously been completely alien to him were now part of the same social fabric, the same vibe that the place radiated. "Can I order one of those specialty coffees?" Victor asked, with a more relaxed smile. Charles, with his usual good humor, prepared the drink without hesitation. "Sure, would you like to try something different this time?" he asked while moving his hands deftly. Victor nodded, letting the aroma of coffee envelop him as he watched the people around. Lena, on the other hand, couldn't stop looking at the atmosphere of the place. The small cafe, in his eyes, was no longer just a physical space, but something symbolic. It was the meeting point for stories and souls that, although different, came together at that very moment. The transformation of the city, of the neighborhood, I was beginning to understand. Carlos poured the drink and handed it to Victor with a smile. "There you go. You won't regret it." Victor, with a slight laugh, sat down at the bar, drinking his coffee cautiously, as if he were looking for something more than just flavor. "This place has something more than just coffee," he said, not realizing how deep it sounded. Lena, who was closer to the table, looked up and nodded slowly. She had felt it too. It was the connection. Something in the air made people share more than they expected, as if the city itself called them to be part of something bigger. Rosa, watching the two, walked over as she gave them a new round of cups at other tables. "This place is not just for coffee, it's so that everyone who crosses here can take something else with them, a piece of community, of humanity," he explained, with an almost philosophical tone. Carlos, who had also listened, was thoughtful for a moment. "It's funny how, over time, all this started to happen without us looking for it so much," he said, looking at the people, and then turning his attention to the two. Victor, thoughtful, took a sip of his coffee and then spoke. "Maybe what is missing in many places in the world is that collective feeling. This place has what many cities have lost, soul." Rosa smiled, feeling Victor's every word resonate with the reason why he had decided to open the cafe in the first place. He was a key piece in a larger structure that he didn't yet fully understand. "It's what we always dreamed of. That people felt welcome, no matter where they came from or what happened before they got here," Rosa said. Lena, who was watching in silence, finally broke the still moment. "I think we can all learn something from this place," he said, with a mixture of admiration and a hint of uncertainty. Carlos returned a warm smile. "There are no trials here. Just coffee, good company, and the freedom to be yourself. That's what makes the difference." The three of them were silent for a moment, each thinking about their own experiences, but at the same time connected by something none of them had anticipated, a small coffee that had left a mark on their hearts. As the hours passed, the atmosphere of the cafe transformed. The warm light from the lamps created a welcoming atmosphere, while the conversations around flowed naturally, as if people had left behind any burden to immerse themselves in the moment. Carlos began to organize the ordering table while observing Victor, who was absorbed in his thoughts, looking at the coffee and then at the people who filled the premises. It was an afternoon like any other, but somehow it looked different. Lena, seeing the same change in dynamics, decided to approach Victor, still cautious, but with a growing curiosity. "You know, I've always thought that places like this have something special. But it's more than just the walls, tables, and chairs. It's the people who choose to come here," she commented, a little thoughtful. Victor looked at her for a moment before answering. "That's true. There's something intangible. It's not just the coffee nor the soft music in the background. It's as if each person brings a story with them and somehow they all intertwine. I don't know how to explain it, but here everyone seems to find something, whether it's comfort, understanding, or just a place where they feel free to be who they are. Rosa, who had been arranging the cups at the bar, heard his words and nodded. That's what motivated me to open this place. I wanted everyone to be able to come here and find shelter, something that would bring them together no matter what they were going through. I knew that sometimes a good coffee and a conversation with a stranger can change the perspective of an entire day, he said with a smile. Carlos, who had been brewing another batch of coffee, added in a calm tone. The curious thing is that without realizing it, this place became a small community center. It may not change the world, but it can touch the lives of those who enter. That is already something important. Lena was thoughtful at those words. Somehow, what Carlos said resonated deeply with her. In his travels, in his experiences, he had seen many places destined to do business, but few that, like this one, seemed to have a real purpose behind them. A purpose that went beyond the economic and touched on the emotional and social. The conversation began to flow more easily between the three of them. Lena talked about her life, what she had seen on her travels, the difficulties she had faced, and how, on many occasions, she had felt disconnected from the world around her. Victor shared his thoughts on how he often felt stuck in a rut, with no real connection to what he was doing. Sometimes it seems like life is full of noise, but we don't really listen to what matters, Victor commented in a reflective tone. Rosa looked at him and nodded. That's true. We're all so busy, so focused on our own worries, that we forget how to connect with what really matters to us. A place like this, although small, offers a space for that, to stop for a moment and listen. Carlos, who had been watching silently, joined the conversation. It's funny how, in the end, all we are looking for is a little peace, a bit of genuine connection. Perhaps if we all had more places like this, we could begin to heal the small cracks that we sometimes carry inside without even realizing it. Lena looked at them, feeling that this small though simple coffee shop had changed the way she perceived many things in her life. The conversation had opened something inside him, a space for reflection and understanding. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening brought in one more group of customers. Rosa rose quickly to attend to them, but not before taking one last look at the two friends. This place will always be here for you, as for anyone looking for a moment of peace, a space to breathe. Victor smiled and raised his cup in gratitude. It wasn't just a coffee that he had found that afternoon, but something deeper, something that could not be touched, but felt. Lena, with a thoughtful look, also raised her cup. In that small cafe, he had found something he had been looking for a long time without knowing it. The murmur of the city outside continued, but inside that small shelter, time seemed to have stopped. Lives intersected, stories were woven, and for a brief moment everything seemed to make clearer sense. The afternoon was slowly progressing, and the bustle of the city outside was fading away, barely noticeable from inside the cafeteria. The customers were dispersed little by little. Some stayed to read, others simply enjoyed the company of the friends with whom they had arrived. Rosa, Carlos, Victor and Lena were in a small corner, with the soft lights and the aroma of coffee enveloping the air. Lena, who had been pensive for several minutes, broke the silence. His tone was softer but also more determined. You know, I never thought I'd encounter something like this in the middle of my trip. Most of the places I've visited seemed empty to me, as if they had no soul. But here, there's something different, he said, looking around with a new appreciation. Carlos, who had been cleaning the bar, paused for a moment to listen to her. He smiled before answering. I think it's because here we try to make each person feel at home. It's not just about serving good coffee, but about everyone who enters here taking a piece of what this place represents. There is some magic in people, in their stories. Victor, who hadn't stopped thinking about Lena's words, nodded slowly. It was clear that this small cafe had left a deeper mark on them all than they imagined. It's funny, because we all come here looking for something. Sometimes we don't know what it is exactly, but we seem to find it unintentionally. I came simply because I was told that the coffee here was excellent, but I stayed because something about the place made me feel at peace, like I was in the right place with the right people. Rosa, who had been attentive to the conversation from the bar, approached and sat down next to them. He took a sip of his coffee and with a calm smile added, "Coffee can just be an excuse. What we really do here is create a space where people can be themselves. Some come looking for just a hot cup, but they take something much more valuable, a sense of belonging, of connection. That's what makes this place work. People open up unexpectedly, and that's something we can never force. It just happens." Lena reflected on those words and felt a deep connection to them. I had been to a lot of places where people seemed to go through life without really looking at each other. But here, everything was different. No matter how much time passed, the conversations continued to flow effortlessly, and the laughter was as natural as the sound of coffee bubbling in the cups. "Maybe that's the secret," Lena murmured, her eyes shining with reflection. "Maybe it's about allowing ourselves to be present, without expectations, just living in the moment." Carlos looked at Lena, recognizing in her words a universal truth, something that is sometimes forgotten in daily life. People tend to be so busy looking for more, wanting to move forward, that they forget the importance of stopping, of being. Sometimes it's all we need, a place where we can only be without pressure, without fear. Here in this cafe, it seems that everything stops, and the only thing that matters is what we are sharing at this very moment. Victor nodded with a genuine smile. "And it's something I want to take with me. The world can be chaotic, but there are always corners like this where we can find peace. No matter how complicated everything becomes outside, there will always be a place here for someone like me, or any of us." Rosa smiled broadly upon hearing this, glad to see how her customers, who originally came as strangers, were becoming a kind of family. "That's why this place will never cease to be special," he said with a look full of gratitude, "because it's more than just a coffee shop. It is a refuge." The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and the conversation continued to flow as naturally as before. The bustle of the street was still ongoing, but inside the cafe, time seemed to have stopped. Life, so fast and fleeting, found here a pause, a space to breathe, to be. The clock struck the hours, but in the small shelter of the cafeteria, the passage of time seemed irrelevant. Rosa, Carlos, Victor and Lena continued talking, sharing thoughts and reflections on life. The tranquility of the place had taken hold of them, and as the afternoon faded into a warm evening, something else began to form between them. A deeper connection, a sense of unity that neither had anticipated. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening interrupted the flow of conversation. Everyone turned to the entrance, and a middle-aged man entered, dressed in a long coat and a grey hat. His face was serious, almost absent, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. He looked around, as if looking for something or someone. When his eyes met Rosa's, his expression changed for a moment, acknowledging something familiar. Rosa gently got up from her seat and walked towards him. "Good afternoon," she greeted with a warm smile, recognizing the man from somewhere, though she didn't remember exactly where he was from. The man nodded, his gaze soft but bewildered. Finally, he spoke in a low but firm tone. "I've been looking for a place like this," he said with a slight pause. "I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I had to come." Rosa looked at him curiously, intrigued by the serenity in his voice. He motioned for her to sit down. "There's always room for someone else here." "Do you want a coffee?" she asked, inviting him to take a seat at the table with the others. The man nodded and sat down slowly. Carlos, who had been behind the bar, came over to take his order. "What would you like?" he asked kindly. The man looked at the menu absent-mindedly, and then, as if he had made up his mind, said, "A black coffee." "Just that, please." Carlos nodded and withdrew to prepare the drink, leaving the others to watch the new visitor. Lena, who had initially felt disconnected from the conversation, took the opportunity to speak. "Where do you come from?" he asked, his tone friendly and curious. The man looked up, as if he had just realized that someone was talking to him. He looked at Lena for a moment, assessing whether or not to respond. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, as if he had made up his mind. "I've come from a long journey," he began. his voice deep and somewhat distant. "I have been looking for answers to questions that I do not know if I can even ask. Something brought me here. I don't know exactly what it is, but I have a feeling this is the place I should be." The man's words echoed in the small cafe. It was as if his arrival was not a coincidence, but something deeper, more meaningful. Rosa watched silently, as if something inside her understood exactly what the man was saying. "People come here when they least expect it, looking for answers, but many times they take something more valuable," he said, his eyes shining with an understanding that only a few could grasp. The man looked at her, surprised by the depth of her answer. It was as if Rosa was speaking the same language, that of those who have seen beyond the surface, those who understand life in a way that cannot be explained in simple words. "I think you're right," he replied, with a slight smile. "Perhaps the answers are not found in the final destination, but in the path traveled." As Carlos brought the coffee, the man took a sip, letting the strong, warm flavor envelop him. It seemed that, like coffee, its presence was beginning to warm the atmosphere, transforming the space into something even more welcoming, more human. Rosa, observing all this, thought about what the man had said. "I have been looking for answers to questions that I don't know if I can even ask." There was something in her words that made her feel that this coffee shop was not just a place to enjoy a drink, but a space where souls could find what they were looking for without having to say it out loud. And at that moment, as the sun set over the horizon and night began to take its place, something changed in the air. As if the conversation, the shared stories, the looks, and the smiles are just a small part of something much bigger. The conversation continued with a natural flow, but now it seemed that there was a different energy in the air. Rosa, Carlos, Victor, and Lena realized that something was happening in the small space. The man, who had come in search of answers, began to share more of his story, and as he did so, he seemed to be slowly shedding the burdens that had accompanied him on his journey. "I've lived in many places, but I always felt like something was missing," he said, looking at each of them as he spoke. "I always believed that I would find what I was looking for in the people, in the cities, but everything felt empty, like I'm looking in the wrong place. But now, after so long, I feel like this is the place where I can begin to understand everything." Rosa, who had sat down again, offered him a sympathetic look. He knew what it meant to feel lost, as if life was happening around him, but one couldn't find his own way within it. "Sometimes you have to get lost in order to find yourself," she said softly. His voice was calm, but there was a confidence in his words that seemed to give the man comfort. Charles, who had been listening silently, nodded slowly. He wasn't one given to talking much, but when he did, his words often struck a chord. "It's funny how life takes us down unexpected paths," he said. "I've also had moments when I thought everything was lost, but here in this small place, something changed. And if I could find my way, maybe you can too." The man nodded, taking a moment to process Charles's words. He raised his cup of coffee as if he were silently toasting to what he had just heard. "Perhaps, maybe I've been looking for something that was already here in front of me, in this place. These people," he said quietly, almost like a whisper. Lena, who until that moment had watched in silence, smiled. Sometimes it wasn't the answers that mattered, but the company along the way. She had learned throughout her life that moments of true and deep connection were the ones that taught the most. "Here we are, sharing this space. We may not have all the answers, but we can walk together for a while," Lena commented tenderly. The man looked at her, and for a moment his eyes softened. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, just knowing that he wasn't alone in his search. The connection between them was so palpable that, for a moment, the cafe felt like a refuge, a place of calm amid the uncertainty of the outside world. Victor, who had been silent until now, got up from his seat and went to the window. He watched as the evening light slowly faded, giving way to the darkness of night. But inside the cafeteria, there seemed to be no place for darkness. Instead, there was a soft, warm light enveloping them. "Maybe this is the beginning of something new for all of us," he said, looking at the group with a smile that reflected his own sense of peace. Rosa, upon hearing Victor's words, nodded. There was something inside him that told him that this meeting was not accidental. There was a reason why everyone was there, sharing this special moment. Sometimes the paths we take us to places we hadn't imagined. But when we arrived, we understood why we had to be there, she said, letting the words linger in the air. The man smiled, grateful for the kindness he had found in those words. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The journey wasn't over yet, but at least at that moment, he felt like he had found a place where he could breathe. The atmosphere in the cafeteria continued to be calm, but the words exchanged between them seemed to have created a sort of invisible bridge between the hearts of everyone present. The connection was deep, unhurried, as if time had been suspended in that small refuge. Rosa, although she was not very fond of talking about her emotions, began to feel a need to open up a little more. There was something about this moment that invited her to be vulnerable, something she hadn't experienced before. "Sometimes I think we're all looking for the same thing," he said, looking at each of his tablemates. "Maybe we don't understand it right away, but we're looking for something bigger than ourselves, something that makes us feel like it all makes sense. And in my case, I found it in this little place, in people, in you." Carlos, who had always been an observer rather than a talker, looked up from his cup and leaned forward. His normally serious face now showed an expression of deep reflection. "It's funny how life takes us where we need to be. Not always where we want it to go," he said with a slight smile. "I was also looking for a long time, but sometimes the break comes when we stop looking so much." Lena, who had been listening attentively, was moved by Carlos's words. His mind began to recall moments in his life when he had looked for something outside of it, not realizing that true peace came from within. "I think there's something in ourselves that we only discover when we stop looking outside," Lena said, as if she were speaking to herself, but also to the group. "Sometimes what we need is already inside us. We just don't see it until we learn to listen." The man, who until that moment had remained in a state of silent reflection, looked at Lena with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. For a moment he didn't say anything, but his eyes showed deep emotion. "I never thought that a simple encounter could change my perspective so much," he admitted, almost quietly. Then, as if the conversation had given him the courage to move on, he added, "Maybe I've been looking outside for so long because I didn't want to face what was inside me. But now I feel like I can start doing it." The silence that followed his words was not awkward. On the contrary, it was a silence full of understanding and acceptance. No one needed to say more. Just being there, at that moment, was enough. Victor, who had been watching the scene carefully, slowly got up and walked to the small corner where the window was. He looked outward, towards the sunset that was slowly disappearing, as if he was also looking for something at that instant. A soft sigh escaped his lips before he spoke. "Sometimes, the world seems too big and overwhelming to us, but at times like this, with the right people, the world seems to be a smaller, more manageable place. We realize that we are not as alone as we thought." Rosa nodded, perfectly understanding what Victor meant. It was as if that small space, that coffee shop, had managed to reduce the vast and often intimidating world to something they could understand together. "Maybe that's what we really need," he said, getting up and walking to the counter to ask for something else, a place where we can stop, breathe, and just be. No expectations, no pressure, just being. The man, who had been mute up to that point, looked at Rosa and then at the others. A gleam of recognition appeared in his eyes. "Here, in this place, I feel that I can be myself, and maybe that's what I really needed all this time." Carlos, who was standing now, came over and patted the man lightly on the back, as if he were saying that everything was fine. It was a simple gesture, but charged with a warmth that had characterized the atmosphere of the cafeteria. The man nodded, speechless, but with a look that reflected a kind of deep relief. It wasn't the end of his journey, but he was beginning to understand that sometimes the first step toward inner peace is to accept that we don't always have all the answers. The clock on the wall of the cafeteria marked the passage of time, but for Rosa, Lena, Carlos and Victor, the moment seemed suspended. The air inside the premises was impregnated with a warm feeling, as if the simple act of sharing a space together had transformed the atmosphere into something special, almost sacred. Rosa sat down at the table again, with a cup of hot coffee in her hands. He watched his friends. wondering how something as simple as this encounter could have such a profound impact on their lives. Sometimes I thought it was not necessary to understand everything. Simply being there, surrounded by people who somehow shared her search for meaning, was enough. Carlos, meanwhile, was no longer looking at the ground as he used to. Now his eyes were fixed on the horizon through the window, as if he were looking at something beyond the glass. A small glimmer of hope crossed his face. "Maybe we're here because somehow the universe wants us to be together," he said quietly, almost as an affirmation to himself. His tone was calm, but the words carried a wisdom born of his own challenges. Lena, who had been absorbed in her own thoughts, looked at him in surprise. I'd never heard her speak that way, as if she'd found a new way of looking at things. Perhaps she herself was changing, even if she hadn't noticed it. "I don't know if I believe in those things, Carlos," Lena replied, but without the skeptical tone she usually used. "But I like the idea that we're not here by chance. Maybe there's something bigger that unites us. Something we can't see, but we can feel." The man, who had been sitting quietly up to that point, now nodded his head, as if he had been waiting for a confirmation of his own thoughts. What Lena said resonated with him, not only with him, but with everyone present at the table. They all shared a common feeling. Something bigger had brought them together. "What matters is what we do with this moment," he said, his voice firm and serene. He seemed more confident now, as if he were beginning to find the peace he had sought elsewhere. "We don't know what the future holds, but what we do know is that this moment, here and now, is ours." At those words, Rosa smiled. For the first time in a long time, I felt that there was nothing to fear. The future, while uncertain, seemed less scary when you were surrounded by people to share it with. It didn't matter if the answers came or not. The important thing was to be present, to live in the now. Victor, who had remained in the corner throughout the conversation, approached the table again. With his calm demeanor, he seemed more relaxed than he had been before, as if the conversation had allowed him to release something inside him, something he had stored away for too long. "I suppose we all have our own battles, but maybe it's the company that really helps us," he said, looking at them all with a sincere smile. "Maybe that's what we need more than answers. People to share the journey with, no matter where you go." Victor's words seemed to close a circle. The conversation had gone from the profound to the simple, from personal reflection to shared understanding. It was a reminder that although each of them had their own paths to walk, they weren't really alone. There was something about the human connection that was stronger than any individual challenge. Rosa, feeling the weight of her own words, looked up at the window. The sun was already setting, tinting the sky with orange and pink hues that gave the landscape an air of serenity. Night was already beginning to fall over the city, but inside the cafeteria, the atmosphere was still warm and inviting, like a bubble that protected everyone from outside worries. "Maybe this place, this moment, is all we really need," he said, almost in a whisper. He looked at his friends and realized that, somewhere between words and laughter, they had all found something that united them. The man, who had been listening in silence until that moment, looked at each of them with deep gratitude. Although he did not know what the future held, he understood something essential. There was something in human companionship that had the power to heal, to give hope. Without another word, he rose from his seat, taking a moment to look around. The small space of the cafeteria, which had been the refuge of so many conversations, now seemed a sacred place, filled with the energy of shared thoughts. And for an instant, everyone felt complete. The silence that followed was filled with a deep calm, as if everything they had lived through up to that point had created an invisible bridge between them. None of them knew exactly how to go on, but they all understood that there was no need to talk anymore. They had come to an unspoken understanding. What had been said was enough, and what remained to be said no longer mattered so much. Carlos, who had been looking out the window the whole time, turned to the group with a calm smile. Despite the hardships he had faced, something inside him had changed that night. He no longer saw life as an impossible challenge to overcome, but as a series of moments, some difficult and others full of light. "Maybe the journey isn't just forward, you know?" he said with a new perspective. "Maybe it's also in what we learn along the way, in every step, not just in the destination." Lena, who had been more reserved until now, nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Somehow, that phrase seemed to fit with everything I had experienced lately. The doubts, the fears, the small victories. "I think you're right," he replied, his voice calm, but with a spark of confidence. "And maybe all this time I was focusing too much on getting to a specific place. But not everything in life is a destination. There's beauty in the process as well." Rosa, looking at her friends, felt a sense of gratitude that was hard to describe. There was something in the air in the present moment that filled her with peace. Life was still uncertain, the future was still a mystery, but in that instant, it felt complete. Maybe I didn't need to have all the answers. Perhaps the questions were more important, and the way he faced them, together with the right people, was enough. The man, whose name they did not yet know but who had joined them without warning, stood up with a decision on his face. It was evident that he, too, had found something in the conversation, something that had given her strength to move forward. He looked at each of them with a faint smile and gave them one last look full of gratitude. "Sometimes the answer lies in the small moments," he said, his tone soft but full of determination. "And maybe, just maybe, the fact that I have shared this time with you has been all I needed." And with those words, he went to the door, leaving the cafeteria behind with the same tranquility with which he had arrived. The four watched him leave, without another word. Night had come, but inside the cafeteria everything was still warm, as if the sun was still there. None of the four rushed away. It was not necessary. They had found something far greater than any destination. They had found a connection. With one last glance at the window, Rosa slowly stood up, looking at her friends. "Maybe we don't know where we're going," he said with a smile. "But we don't need to know, because as long as we're together, everything will be fine." Carlos, Lena, and Victor nodded, sharing that tacit understanding. They didn't know what the future held for them, but that didn't matter anymore. Life was here, in this moment, in the conversation, in the company, and that was enough. With one last look at the cafeteria, they said goodbye. The door gently closed behind them, but the sense of peace they had shared didn't fade. It was as if that little corner of the world had become an eternal place, where human connections could heal, strengthen, and transform everything they touched. And with that, the cycle came to an end, in the simplicity of an encounter, in the beauty of being present.